Hello, so today we are going to be looking at taxes. We're going to carry on our taxes journey. So taxes, today we're going to look at the impact of taxes on a wider society, right? So the last couple of lessons we've been having a look on the impact of taxes on those who are in the market, either consumers or producers, so therefore are part of that private transaction. And today we're going to be having a look at the impact of taxes on those outside of the transaction and those inside the transaction, all at once, right? So last lesson I asked you this question. So why is there a tax on alcohol, right? So before we kind of answer this question or have a look at the traditional kind of way to answer this question, I want you to pause the video and have a think about this question if you haven't answered it already. Why do we tax alcohol? So the kind of traditional answer I think that a lot of you got was this one. So we tax to correct market failure, right? Taxes are a form of government intervention, and we know that governments intervene when the market has failed. So we have free market economics, an industry is set up and resources are allocated by the free market. And sometimes that leads to market failure. And that market failure can come under the forms of like missing markets, externalities, and that means that therefore we have government intervention to try and correct that market failure, right? And in this case, if you think about alcohol, we are correcting market failure of overconsumption, right? We have overconsumption, resources are not being allocated efficiently, we have information gaps in the market, because remember, when we consume, we are consuming our utility at this very moment in time. We don't know what's going to happen over the long run, so we're consuming with our utility right now in mind, and we're consuming with our private levels of utility, right? We're not considering everybody else's utility as equal to our own, right? And therefore that means that we overconsume demerit goods, and alcohol is a demerit good. Hopefully I don't have to explain why it's a demerit good or why it has negative externalities, but you know, maybe very briefly I can go over it. So alcohol has negative externalities in the short run and also kind of like in the long run as well. So if you think about in the short run, you might have disorderly behaviour or, you know, kind of short-term illness, but equally in the long term, it has a huge impact on the NHS or the health services, and it has huge impacts to everybody else in society as well. And we're going to have a look at how taxing that industry, that demerit good, can reduce that negative externality. So you have government intervention to reduce the negative externality, because that is the market failure or one of the market failures in the alcohol market. So what happens is you increase the price, you tax the supplier, the supply shifts inwards, and that decreases the quantity demanded because you have an increase in price, and therefore you would hope that that increase in price would lead to a decrease in quantity demanded, and therefore less individuals are consuming that demerit good. Right? So therefore, through that process, that should reduce or completely get rid of the market failure, right? That's why we tax, to get rid of the market failure. And what I would like you to think about is, what is the market failure? What does that market failure look like? I'll give you a hint, you should draw a diagram. Okay. In economics, if there's ever in doubt, just draw the diagram, any diagram. No, not any diagram, but draw a diagram. And this is the diagram that you should have drawn. It is the negative externalities diagram. And we know here that in the short run, well, under free market economics, when you don't have any kind of the idea of missing perfect information, then you're going to have an externality. This is our externalities diagram here. This is our private quantity, this is our private consumption level and private cost, and this is the cost to society under perfect information, right? And we have a negative externality. So we consume under kind of free market economics, no government intervention whatsoever. We're going to consume this much, and it's going to cost you as an individual that much, right? This kind of price here. Say price, and I mean cost, private cost, PC. But when you are consuming at this level, it is obviously affecting society all the way up here. And if you had perfect information and also you valued others' utility as much as your own, right? So if you valued everybody else in society's utility as much as you valued your own utility, then you would consume at this point here. And therefore this triangle, kind of the difference is the negative externality. Again, like for this bit here, to think about the idea of why you would ever do that is, if you think about the golden rule of economics, you can Google it and have a look at it. It's just where you take other people in society's utility as equal to your own utility. Whereas when you are in a free market economy, then you are obviously taking your own utility into consideration. You're not taking anybody else's utility levels from your consumption into consideration. And so what I wanted to do is think about what effect does the tax have here? So what's happening in the market, right? You have a tax put on. So unless the market is perfectly elastic, you are going to have the consumer paying some form of the tax, right? So the consumer is going to burden quite a bit of the tax. Well, maybe not necessarily quite a bit, but they're going to burden some of the tax. If the consumer burdens some of the tax, what is happening to the price level? The price level is increasing. So what is happening in this diagram here? The marginal price is going to be increasing as well, right? So the private cost has increased, right? So therefore, at the same quantity, it is costing individuals more because they're having to pay for the tax as well. So therefore, what is happening is we have an increase in our marginal private cost plus tax. Now, if it is a lump sum tax, then obviously it's going to shift parallel. If it is a ad valorem tax, it's going to shift and increase the gradient as well, because the more you consume, the more it's going to increase your cost by. And what has happened here? We now have a new market, for market, private market equilibrium quantity, and it's increased the private cost, right? So we've had an increase in the private cost and we've had a decrease in the amount consumed. Now that should reflect, or should remind you at least, of the industry diagram, because this is the private individual from the industry diagram. So what's happening to them in the industry is going to happen to them on the externalities diagram, okay? And therefore we can see here that at this level, we are affecting society less because our consumption has fallen, right? And therefore the size of our externality is a lot smaller, right? So our externality is a lot smaller. Wonderful. Which is what you want. And I have a quick question for you now. I would like you to think about what would be the perfect level of tax? What would be the best perfect level of tax that the government could set on a demerit good? Think about it and have a go at doing it on a diagram. So the perfect amount of tax is obviously going to be the amount of tax that shifts the marginal private cost to the point where it is equal to the marginal social cost at the quantity of the social equilibrium, right? So because what happens when you do that? Well, this is what happens. I put P-tax because it's the perfect level of tax. You obviously have no externality because your marginal private cost is equal to your marginal social cost, which is equal to your marginal private benefit, which is equal to your marginal social benefit, right? And therefore you have no externality in the market. Everybody's consuming the amount that is both maximising their own utility but also maximising the society's utility as well. So therefore we are all perfect. So the perfect amount of tax is the tax that means that this shifts to the point of here. Now doesn't happen often, and if it does happen it's usually by accident. Because the level of information that the government would need to be able to do that is often impossible to come by. Because markets change so rapidly, number one, but also because that amount of information is just an incredibly vast amount of information, right? So the idea is you would shift from there to there and you would have no externality in the perfect level of tax. Actually, what we tend to happen most often is that you reduce the externality, you don't completely get rid of the externality. So there are some cases where the externality has been able to get rid of, and we'll have a look at those in the upcoming weeks actually, but it's so rare, and it's definitely much rarer with negative externalities than it is with positive externalities. But I would like you to think about now, so this is all perfect in theory. If everything lined up, the negative externality would be reduced. But we're talking about the market for alcohol, and the market for alcohol is inelastic, right? So if you increase the price a lot, then you're going to have a less than proportional change in the quantity demanded, right? So therefore, if the market is inelastic, we're not really going to see hardly any of a shift in the marginal private cost, because we're not just taking into account the cost of buying the product, we're also taking into account the economic costs as well, right? So like all of the other costs, and you're not really going to shift that marginal private cost up by very much if it's a completely or a very, very inelastic market. So therefore, how on earth does that correct the market failure? Well, it does, or it can. It doesn't always do it, but it can. So what is the point of taxing something like cigarettes or alcohol when it's incredibly inelastic? Well, number one, it stops new entrants, right? If cigarettes are really, really cheap, then people who are outside of the market might be like, oh, well, I'll give it a go because the cost of entering the market might be lower than the actual benefits. But actually what you're doing is you're increasing the cost to not just those who are inside the market, but also those who are potentially thinking about entering the market as well. So as young people, you might be less inclined to smoke cigarettes or drink alcohol if it is incredibly expensive for you to enter the market, right? Because that increases your opportunity cost. You are less able to spend that income that you may have on anything else, right? So you can't enter any other markets because the cost of entering this market is so high. So one of the things that it does, one of the ways that it kind of corrects market failure is it corrects future potential market failure, right? You are less inclined to enter the market because of the cost to enter the market, right? The cost is higher. The barriers to entry for you to enter that market are higher because the cost is higher, right? So one of the ways that it does correct market failure is it kind of corrects future market failure by stopping any new entry into the market, right? But how does it correct the market failure of the market that already exists, those individuals who are currently in the market? Well, it does, right? Well, hopefully it does. And one of the ways it does that is because if you are going to smoke, you have to pay for your additional cost, right? So actually what happens is, if you're going to drink a lot of alcohol or if you're going to smoke a lot of cigarettes, then you are going to have to pay over time for every single unit that you consume more income, right? You're going to make more of your income. It's going to cost you more and more and more, and that's going to be a financial cost. And then what can happen is that financial cost is then used to offset some of the financial cost of you smoking or drinking, whichever example you want to use, right? So for instance, if you are going to drink for your entirety of your life and you're going to damage your liver, then normally if you weren't paying a tax, then it would be society that would have to pay for the cost of you to have potentially a liver transplant, or for you to get treatment for your alcoholism, or for you to get treatment for any illness that you have that is arised from alcohol abuse. But if you have to pay a large tax, and the same with cigarettes as well, if you have to pay a large tax, then actually what is happening in the market is you are kind of paying for your own externality over time. So you can use that tax to fund the NHS for operations or any kind of support that might be needed for individuals who are consuming that particular demerit good. Now that might be cigarettes and alcohol are completely kind of valid examples, but also the tax on sugar can also fall under this umbrella as well. But what does that have to do with the diagram? Well, that reduces the marginal social cost of your consumption because you're kind of paying for your own consumption, your own externality later on down the line. So rather than shifting your marginal private cost upwards, actually what you're doing is you're shifting your marginal social cost downwards, which is decreasing the externality, right? Because society is not paying for your consumption of the demerit good, the kind of issues that arise from overconsumption. You are paying for the issues that arise from overconsumption through the tax on whatever good it is that you are over-consuming. So market failure is corrected, but it's just kind of corrected in a different way. It's not the most effective way to correct the market failure because obviously you're still going to have to consume a huge amount over time, and it doesn't stop your immediate consumption levels. and it means that actually the marginal social quantity that can be consumed in society increases, which has its own problems, but it does over the long term reduce the effect to the whole of society. So I hope that has been useful for you, and I can't wait to go through some other stuff to do with externalities and market failure with you later on this week. Have a good time. Bye guys.